Carpio is now looking at the possibility of filing a petition before the Commission on Elections to do just that.
Other candidates may also be inclined to file similar petitions, and Carpio says one should expect the case to reach the Supreme Court.
Presidential candidate Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was convicted of tax evasion more than 20 years ago, which supposedly should be grounds for his disqualification from the presidential race. How will the Supreme Court and the Commission on Elections decide on this matter? We discuss in this episode of The Chiefs. Welcome to The Chiefs. I'm Robbie Alampay. With us online, Ami Pamintuan of the Philippine Star, joining us from Manila. Lucy Cruz Valdez of News 5. She's in Quezon City. And here in our studios in Mandaluyong is Ed Lingao of One News.
Happy weekend.
Happy Friday.
Hello, happy weekend.
Ami, nakamute ka na naman.
Ha?
Ayan.
Nakamute ka?
Ayan.
Ayan na. Ano ba? Ano?
Okay na.
Okay. Anong headline bukas?
Di yung alert level 3 pa rin tayo for the next 2 weeks.
Oo nga.
Iluwagan naman yung yung transportation.
Ay, well,
Yes.
linuwagan is an ironic term kasi linuwagan para 100% yung capacity para siksikan yung mga tao doon.
Oo nga.
Saka marami na rin naman nagva-violate even before this move to loosen, di ba, passenger count. So,
At saka grabe yung traffic this
Grabe.
added tonight it took me 30 to 40 minutes longer than usual.
Talaga? Walang traffic eh.
Naka-bike lane ka yata eh. Bawal ang motorsiklo sa bike lane, ha?
Hindi naman ako Hindi mo na ako violator.
Okay. Hindi pwede. Tsaka mahalaga, speaking of violator, kung wala kang violation sa
Pwede kang 10
traffic,
years.
you qualify for a 10-year driver's license.
10-year driver's license.
Which means to say, lahat tayo hindi qualified. Pero yung mga
Ay,
walang,
hindi,
yung mga
hindi.
walang
Oy,
violation,
excuse
Ako,
me.
wala akong
Pwede
huli.
ako dyan.
walang huli.
Wala, ibang
Iba
usapan
yun sa
yun,
walang
ano,
violation.
Walang violation.
Speaking of kung may huli o may violation, our first guest tonight, okay ba segue?
Okay yan.
Is retired Supreme Court Senior Associate Justice Antonio Carpio, and we'll try to distinguish between may huli o may violation on
At
tonight's
anong
topic.
gravity ng violation?
Justice Carpio, welcome po to the big story once again.
Good
Thank you. Good
evening,
evening.
Justice.
Thank
Good
you, sir.
evening, everyone.
Now, of course, sir, we invited you because of your column. You were saying that because of this tax evasion case, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is something na lumampas na sa RTC, lumampas na sa Court of Appeals. This is now considered final and executory, di ba? So it's a clear conviction on a tax evasion, You're saying that based on that, that amounts to moral turpitude, which should be basis to disqualify Ferdinand Marcos Jr. from the elections. My question is there precedent for this? Is this established, or is this still just legal theory at this point?
Well, there have been many candidates who were disqualified because when they filed their certificates of candidacy, it turned out that they had a prior conviction involving moral turpitude or involving imprisonment of more than 18 months. No? Madami na yan. You have Halosos, you have Aratea, ang dami na. So it's established that the provision has been applied several times. The question here is, since Marcos Jr. Was imposed a penalty of 3 years on 2 counts each, but the Court of Appeals removed the imprisonment and only left the fine. So he would not fall under that provision where the sentence is imprisonment of more than 18 months. But there is an or the offense involved moral turpitude. And moral turpitude is a broad term, no? And that will be for the COMELEC initially and for the Supreme Court to decide if the failure to file income tax returns for several years repeatedly constitutes moral turpitude. My opinion is, if it's just 1 year, you can say it's not moral turpitude. Nakalimutan mo lang. Because there is no intent to evade. There is moral turpitude if there is intent to evade payment of the tax. But if you repeatedly fail to file it consecutively for several years, it would look like there is an intent to evade payment of a tax. So nasa COMELEC yan, and ultimately nasa Supreme Court and Bank to decide if it falls under that phrase, moral turpitude, no? If there was an intent, if repeatedly failing to file your income tax returns constitute moral turpitude.
Okay, so everything,
Sa kanila yun.
yeah, so everything now turns on the legal definition of moral turpitude.
Yes, moral turpitude would depend on the circumstances of its case. Katulad yan, I would say, pag nakalimutan mo lang 1 year to file, walang moral turpitude. There is no clear intent to evade. Pero pag palagi yan, several years, sunod-sunod, baka may moral turpitude yan. Nasa discretion na ng court yan. Nasa appreciation na nila yan.
Well, sir, I looked it up and I came across a Supreme Court decision in 1979, Zari versus Flores, where evasion of income taxes was listed as among the crimes involving moral turpitude. But then again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know
Yes.
how to put that into context.
Yeah.
Would that be a precedent and would that apply?
Yes, madami namang clearly evasion, tax evasion is moral turpitude. But if you just fail to file it once, it might not have been an intent to evade. Baka nakalimutan mo lang. So, kasi nasa frame of mind mo yan intent to evade payment of the tax. Dapat makita yung intent from conduct itself of the person. So pag once lang, in my view, give na yan kasi baka nakalimutan lang yan. Pero pag sunod-sunod, malabo na yan, di ba? So it's really up to the court now.
In cases like this, who makes the first move? Will somebody among the candidates file, or it can be anybody?
Yeah.
Or will it be the COMELEC or what? Paano yan,
Or
sir?
isang
Any
bayan.
registered voter, because the candidate is a candidate for a national office, so it's any registered voter in the Philippines can file. And there is a time period.
With the COMELEC? With the
Yes,
COMELEC?
you have to file it with the COMELEC.
Yes.
Sir, diretso ko na, sir.
And if
Would that
you-
be you? Kasi you brought it up already anyway in your column. Would that registered voter be you?
Well, I'm a registered voter, of course, but there many will file. I am sure there will be many who will file.
Is there a precedent for this involving a national candidate?
Madami. Remember, there was a petition to cancel the certificate of candidacy of FPJ on the ground of citizenship, also of Grace Po on the ground of citizenship. You file it within 25 days from the time they filed their certificate of candidacy. So Marcos Jr. filed his certificate of candidacy October 6. So you have until October 31 to file, but 31 falls on a Sunday, so it's the next working day, which is November 2.
I
malapit na yun. Teka, so, sir,
I
go
didn't
ahead.
necessarily catch the entire thing, but if I heard it right kanina, former COMELEC Commissioner Louis Guia, I think was doing you one better. He said na actually kung tama lahat yan, it is simply
affirmed, kung finality, with finality
diba?
ang decision.
May finality in decision executory. He was saying, ano na lang yan
Virtually automatic.
administrative duty na lang ng COMELEC yan do you agree?
Yeah, because you file it, it's an administrative case, no? But you have to file a petition. Somebody, a registered voter, any registered voter in the Philippines can file. And they'll have to decide that before the election. No?
Declaration of...
Because
before the elections.
one basic
Okay.
question po, none of us here have ever filed to run for any elective post. But I imagine when you fill up a form, you're asked, di ba? Parang, have you ever been
Been
convicted,
convicted.
and so on.
And
So
swear,
that should have been faithfully
Oo nga.
and with good faith filled in, di ba?
That is not in the certificate of candidacy. Nakalagay lang doon, you attest that you are eligible for the office. Now, eligible for the office has been defined by the Supreme Court as you are not disqualified. You have all the qualifications and none of the disqualifications. So if you were convicted by final judgment, you are disqualified. And if you state there that you are qualified, you sign, that is a material
Perjury.
misrepresentation. That is a false material representation, ground for cancellation of your certificate
But I
of candidacy.
cannot in good faith, I cannot be taken in good faith as saying that I didn't know that a prior conviction would have disqualified me.
Well, if you were accused in court and you appeared there, well, I don't see how you can argue that you didn't know.
Yes, sir. But he can also argue, conversely, he can also argue that there's nothing that proves that this was a crime involving moral turpitude.
That's his defense. That will be his argument that repeated failure to file an election return does not involve moral turpitude. Yun yung defense niya.
Okay.
Ang
So that
problema,
will be the issue.
a final judgment na yon, Justice.
Yes, because when the RTC of Quezon City imposed the judgment, he appealed to the Court of Appeals. And the Court of Appeals said, affirmed, but you just pay a fine, walang imprisonment. And then he filed a notice of appeal to the Supreme Court, but withdrew it kasi, of course, pag ituloy niya yun, makokorek yun eh. Because when you appeal
Yes.
in a criminal case from Court of Appeals to the Supreme Court, the doctrine is you open everything. Everything is put under review. If there is any error, it can be corrected by the court. So not that natanggal na yung imprisonment, hindi na pwedeng ibabalik yun. Ibabalik yun pag mali yun. That's why we call it throws wide open the case again for complete review by the Supreme Court. So, winidraw niya kasi, of course, babayaran niya na lang yung fine, tapos na, wala na yung imprisonment. Kaya lang, meron pang or moral turpitude doon na ngayon yan. That's now the issue.
Pero sir, I need to go
Okay,
back to
this-
what you said earlier na hanggang October 31 lang ang filing ng petitions for
Filing.
disqualification. Did I hear you right? Kasi yun nga,
Well,
that's
no,
just a
kasi
few days from now.
nakalagay doon sa Section 78, if you want to file a petition to cancel certificate of candidacy, you must file it within 25 days after the certificate of candidacy has been filed. Final ni Marcos Jr., October 6. So you count 25 days after that, that's October 31. But October 31 is a Sunday. So you have to file it the next working day. The next working day is November 2 because it has been declared a special working holiday. That means all government offices are open. So you have to file it on November 2.
Yes, sir. So I need to go back to my earlier question. Are you going to do anything about this? Kasi you brought up the issue, and now you're also bringing up the idea that there's only until Tuesday to act on this issue.
Well, alam na ng mga abogado yan eh. After I wrote that column, I received a lot of text. They will file. So sabi ko, bahala kayo.
And you're saying required ng COMELEC to act on it within a certain period.
Well, normally they have to decide that before election day.
Normally.
And what if it's appealed with the Supreme Court?
Well, let us say the COMELEC will decide it immediately and say he's qualified. Then the petitioners can go to the Supreme Court to appeal.
And that can take a lot of time beyond election day. Kasi iniisip ko,
Posible, but in many cases sumobra. But of course, pag decide ng Supreme Court, that will retroact. Pag sinabi kasi the consequence is if you file a false material representation in your certificate of candidacy, the doctrine is that certificate of candidacy is void
Null and
from
void.
the very start. It is as if you were never a candidate.
So,
So bura lahat.
people cannot vote on him. Yan lang ang gusto ko malaman.
Lahat na vote sa kanya, stray vote,
Stray vote.
and
Pero,
therefore void.
pero pwede,
Hindi bibilangin.
hindi siya,
Hindi
hindi,
bibilangin.
hindi bibilangin. Kasi iniisip ko,
Kung natuloy siya, natuloy kasi the decision came out late after the election, then
Yes.
the votes will be considered stray votes, void, and since
Well,
as if hindi siya tumakbo kasi
Yeah.
it's a void certificate of candidacy, burado yon. Pag isa lang ang kalaban niya, yung isa lang ang i-declare.
COMELEC
That is the
is
win.
not supposed to count. Kasi yun ang importante. The COMELEC should not count the votes for him.
Hindi, pag wala pang decision, siyempre, ibibilangin.
Kasi yan ang iniisip
Pero
ko. Kapag nangyari yon, na binilang yon, sasabihin, halimbawa, let's say manalo siya. Sasabihin, well, the people have spoken eh.
Yes.
Well, but there are cases ganyan, na bilang, but dumating yung decision, binura lahat, considered void. That's the jurisprudence.
Medyo,
Of course, kasi presidential election ito, it's a national election, the COMELEC and the Supreme Court, I'm sure, will act on time.
Sir, I have to ask you about this. Kasi,
Let me just ask also, just from from the judicial perspective, what may have been the reason that the Court of Appeals did not impose the punishment of imprisonment? I just wonder, is that an oversight? And if so, doesn't the system correct such an oversight? I'm just curious.
Well, I said inexplicably. I cannot also understand it. But when it went to the Supreme Court did not have a chance to correct it because we need draw nga. And the Solgen did not file his own appeal. So if the Solgen does not appeal, and it's only the private party that appeals, but later on withdraws it, walang magagawa ang Solgen. Wala siyang appeal eh.
Okay.
First, sir, why now? I mean, this was in 1997. Since then, he's been able to run for governor and win. He's been able to run twice for the Senate. He's been able to run for the vice presidency, and now he's running for president. So, syempre, the question is, bakit ngayon lumitaw, bakit ngayon lumabas, and why wasn't it used beforehand?
Well, before nobody saw it, nobody brought it up. You know, I didn't even know about this. I just got it a week ago in the Viber groups of our Viber groups. They circulated it, so I checked. No, I didn't even know that there was this conviction. I'm sure you also didn't know.
Kasi mga bata pa kami nun eh.
you also mentioned the failure to pay real estate taxes on his father's estate. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, the Supreme Court said that because when a person dies, the heirs should file the estate tax
Estate
return and
tax.
pay the estate tax. That's required. And if you do not file, the BIR will file it based on available records. And this is what happened because the Marcos family refused to file. So it was the BIR that filed it based on available records, including the Swiss accounts. So lamaki. And when the BIR sent the notice of assessment, you really have 30 days only to contest that. If you don't contest that, it becomes final and inappealable. They did not bother to reply, to answer. They just ignored all of these notices.
Yeah.
So the BIR filed an auction to auction off the properties, and that's the only time they went to the Court of Appeals. And the Court of Appeals affirmed the BIR assessment. So the Marcoses appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court affirmed it again. And it became final. And because there is a penalty, there's an interest on the principal tax amount of 20% a year.
Ay, naku pala.
Okay.
And for failure to file, there's a penalty surcharge of 20% right away. On top of that, there's also interest on that surcharge. So lumaki talaga. It's now per my computation, about 203 billion.
Justice, going back to the ITR case that was the topic of your column, if it gets to the Supreme Court, as you said, then the question is defining moral turpitude. No, is this covered by moral turpitude? But can the Supreme Court in that case, since can they also look at the original administrative inexplicable gap in the Court of Appeals decision? Can the Supreme Court basically say, never mind moral turpitude, this should have qualified from the very start as something that should have been met at 18 years?
Well, they cannot anymore because that decision has become final. It cannot be changed anymore.
Okay.
You're just lucky if the Court of Appeals made an error, whether it was intentional or not. We cannot discuss it here because we don't have the facts. But we are all bound by that decision. It became final already. It cannot be changed.
Okay.
Sir, in the end, it seems that it will all boil down to the perception and the judgment of number one, the COMELEC, and number two, the Supreme Court, on how you define moral turpitude. So then it becomes very subjective. I tried to look it up, and there are definitions in Black's Law Dictionary, but they're pretty broad, and basically it's a definition that's undefined. So in the end, parang bahala na si Batman kung kanya-kanyang pananaw kung anong ibig sabihin.
Well, with respect to tax evasion, meron namang mga decisions that for it to constitute moral turpitude, the failure to file or to pay tax must evince an intent to evade the tax. So there's an intentional evasion to pay the proper tax, no? Or to file the return. So nasa judge na yan, nasa korte na yan to decide 4 or 5 years of failure. Does that constitute an intent to evade payment of the tax? Nasa kanila na yon. But for me, pag isa lang, I would say you cannot deduce anything there na there's an intent. Pwede nakalimutan.
Justice, can I digress a bit?
Yes?
Kumusta naman yung isang bayan ngayon and your candidate?
Well, right now, we are continuing to organize our chapters because we need people on the ground. Because, on election day, you must have watchers in every precinct. And there are at least 95,000 precincts nationwide, and you have to have at least 2 watchers. That's almost 200,000 people. And you have to have those 200,000 people on the ground to watch for vote protection. So we're organizing, and there's also, you have to start your media campaign online. We're doing the usual thing, but we're also looking at vote protection.
And fundraising, kumusta yung fundraising? It's very important, of course, in any campaign.
Yes, it's very important, but at this time, the contributors are looking kung whether you are rating or not. So it's early days now, but I have talked to many of these businessmen. They said, if you have a viable candidate, of course, we don't want to have another 6 years of the Duterte administration where our contracts are just canceled. Even if we win in the arbitration abroad, they will just refuse to enforce the arbitration. So I'm sure they are willing to contribute, but you have to show that you are viable.
Is the effort to forge a common opposition candidate still alive? Are you still trying to forge a common candidate?
Well, it continues until November 15, but we're now looking at if we cannot unify the candidates, we will unify the voters.
Okay, but in the meantime, how are the other parties and the other candidates engaging, if at all, with Isang Bayan?
Well, I'm not involved in the discussions on unification because we're done with that. We are only strengthening now our organization. the unification efforts are with the candidate, with the VP Lenny Robredo.
Sir, meron pong phone-in question si Joby Francisco coming from other reporters who are covering the campaign. Kayo po ba, meron na raw na pinal na sagot kung kayo po itatakbo bilang senador?
Well, I did not file my certificate of candidacy because I said from the very start, being chair of Isang Bayan and being the head of the selection committee as to who will be the candidates for president, vice president, senators, I cannot be in a situation where there is a conflict of interest where I will put my name also.
Yes,
So
sir.
I'm not running at all.
Yes, sir.
I've repeatedly said that.
Is that final? Kasi there's always the November 15 substitution deadline, and you know how it is right now.
That's final. It's been final on day one.
Justice
How do you feel about what looks now like, in a way, your inability, Sambayan's inability to, well, precisely to come up with a unified slate, especially now that we're seeing that there's so much sharing of candidates among the different political parties and presidentials, which I'm sure was not what you had envisioned Isang Bayan would be able to do. How do you feel about that?
Well, of course, we are saddened by the failure to unify, but we are also realistic. It was just an aspiration, but we had a fallback position, being realists. We have our feet on the ground. So if it does not happen, we have to have a fallback position. We will unify the people. So we are there.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Justice Antonio Carpio. Sir, maraming salamat po.
Ingat, sir.
Thank you also. for
Thanks,
having me.
Justice.
Ingat po kayo.
Thank you.
We'll take a break. Please stay with us. The Chiefs will be right back.
Welcome back to the Chiefs here in One News, and now joining us is attorney Angela Ibay, Climate and Energy Program Head of the World Wildlife Fund Philippines. Good evening, Attorney Ibay, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Chiefs.
Good evening, attorney.
Good evening.
Evening. Good evening to everyone.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, well, the last week of October, magkakaroon po ng Climate Summit in Glasgow, Scotland. But unfortunately, people right now are more familiar with the COVID than the COP26. So let's go back to
Very
basics
true.
muna. Let's go back to basics muna. What do we expect from COP26? What exactly is it?
Yeah, so the nickname is COP. Of course, it stands for the Conference of Parties. And these parties are actually countries that are part of or who signed on to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So basically the countries are coming together for the 26th time, supposed to be, of when they will be meeting to decide on various aspects on climate change. And it's happening in Glasgow in the United Kingdom this year.
Is there any big ticket item in COP26? Is there any big item on the agenda right now that you and all of us should be watching?
Actually, there's a lot. A big thing, because one is COP26 was supposed to have happened last year. So it was postponed due to the pandemic, like anything else. And so 1 year of delay in deciding on many things on terms of the effect of climate change is it has very critical aspects that we haven't been able to do. And when we look at the science, and this year actually the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out recently with a report on the physical science of climate change, and they just really reiterated how important it is for us to get to a temperature goal that is below 1.5. Otherwise, many of the things or the impacts of climate change will just accelerate and happen too much. In COP26, the presidency will be the UK, of course, and they do have certain goals that they want to do. One is they want to be able to accelerate decarbonization, and halt, of course, deforestation. Another is to ensure that they mobilize finance, and that's one of the critical things that us in WWF we're pushing for. And also to be able to also, for us, we want to be able to ensure that the discussion of nature, such as nature-based solutions and how nature can help and adapt, and people can adapt to that, will be included in the discussions of COP26. And aside from finance, we want to ensure also that aside from the talk and all of the policies or whatever is included in written form, we really should be pivoting to implementation when they come back to our respective countries.
Didn't you have a certain set of objectives that were committed to by the COP members in the Paris Agreement? This was
Yes.
6 years ago, right? How was that monitored? And in particular, for example, the Philippines. How did we do in terms of meeting, for example, the commitment to reduce temperature by, I think it was 2.1 or something, wasn't it, in the Paris Agreement?
Yes.
Nagawa ba natin? How far away are we from that goal?
Well, of course, the Philippines were one of a number of countries, but one of the things that all countries had committed to under the Paris Agreement was to come out with what we call the Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC. So, so Paris happened in 2015. So 5 years after the Secretariat of the Convention, the Climate Change Convention, came out with a synthesis report just recently of who are the countries who have submitted and what is the impact of all of those countries put together in terms of emissions reduction. Because these nationally determined contributions are basically state what each country would contribute in order to reach that temperature goal.
Right,
And while there are, I think, based on the synthesis report, there's 192 countries that have already submitted, and they've updated that report last September. But apparently, there will still be a 16% increase in emissions by 2030, based on what's been committed in the NDCs. And hopefully, with this in COP26, we'll be able to get more countries to really do enhancement of those NDCs, meaning that by 2025, when the global stocktake comes into 2023, when global stocktake actually starts, we will see countries starting to commit again to check on whether in fact they're reaching their first commitment of reduction, and then once they've done that, hopefully enhance what we call the ambition of reducing more from what they've already done.
And do you hope to get a greater or stronger commitment from the United States now with President Biden? Because President Trump noon, di ba? He was uncooperative in regard to the Paris Agreement.
Well, there is optimism now that there is a change in administration. They did say that they're coming back into the negotiating table. They have submitted their own commitments in terms of their own NDCs as well as the financing. And that's a very critical aspect. because developed countries in the Paris Agreement had committed that they will mobilize $100 billion by
Yes.
2020. And that
Saka
would
sila yung sila yung
Oo.
especially the United States, di ba? Sila ang greatest contributor to the carbon emissions,
yes.
right?
Yes, historically. So they have, and we're hopeful that for these negotiations. But of course, we have to get also those other high emitting countries, developed countries as well. And also see how developing countries like the Philippines can be able to also adapt more. Because the challenge for developing countries is really we are impacted by climate change. Like the Philippines is the fourth most vulnerable country based on a recent climate risk index. And we know we have these impacts. We know that climate change is happening to us, and we definitely will need a lot of the financing so that we will have concrete projects on the ground that can help us adapt. But we also need that so that we can also have the mitigation aspect, meaning we can have projects that will really also reduce emissions of the country itself, so that we also contribute to this global goal, attaining that global goal. Now we will keep the the temperature rise to less than 1.5 degrees.
Attorney, the past 2 years, of course, we've all been preoccupied with the pandemic, and meron naman daw magandang epekto to, nabawasan daw yung pollution, and people became plantitas and plantitas, at least in our country. But overall, climate change took a backseat, the past 2 years. Can you be more specific about the impact of the pandemic on climate change mitigation efforts in our country?
Well, in our country, it's true, that in a way the discussion of climate really took a backseat because of COVID. That's why we've always also, as WWF and many other organizations, have been saying countries have developed yung mga economic packages, recovery packages for COVID, right? But we're saying that if you're designing those packages, there's a way to design it that you're also considering the green aspect, meaning making things more sustainable, because it's an opportunity for us to be able to also transition our systems, our way of living, the same way that the new normal that we have will also be a green new normal. And that's what we've been pushing since last year. And I think...
Can you give an example of what we can do, na proper way of transitioning?
Well, one of the things that we would like to say is that last year, the DOE, in fact, announced a coal moratorium. That was October 2020. And we welcomed that announcement, meaning no new coal projects will be entertained. But there are still some coal projects that are still in the pipeline. And I think this will help us hopefully transition further to get more renewables into the system. So that's a very welcome development. But of course, we had to, because of the pandemic, we also had to rethink also the way energy is not only produced but also consumed. Ang nangyari is that because all of us started to work from home, the demand from energy moved from the commercial to the residential. So I think one of the things people can really do is look at what your own home uses in terms of energy. Are you energy efficient enough? In fact, we just had a new law, the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act, which was released in 2019, just before the pandemic. And I hope people will take this to heart, that it's not just for government offices, but your own house can actually be energy efficient. Therefore, you can have lesser pressure on the energy demand and in our country. And those are many things can be done, like the simple things that we always say. changing your lighting to more energy efficient light bulbs. Your appliances can be more energy efficient. Don't use it if you don't need it. So many things can be done even at home. And I think the awareness of the link between nature and our health became more apparent.
Yes,
And in
Yeah.
fact, even for transport, many people, diba, because there is no transport in a few months of the lockdown, people started either walking or biking. And I hope that continues. And I think there are a lot of cities now who are now really promoting what we call sustainable mobility, ensuring that bike lanes are located and properly designated so that you will encourage more people to use biking as well as maybe walking from place to place rather than having using their own cars if
Attorney, Attorney Ibay, as you said, no, mahalaga na that we make that connection from Glasgow, Scotland, to our own homes and our own lives. I mean, but the bad news, of course, is that we're in the middle of election season, and honestly, nobody's talking about climate change. None of the candidates are talking about climate change, and voters are not asking about climate change also of their candidates. How would you frame questions relevant to climate change that we can ask candidates and that will compel candidates to talk about climate change and at the same time that will make it something concrete for voters as they watch their candidates? Hey, give us a few questions that we should be asking candidates that will drive home the point as well and make a connection with people at home.
Na masasagot nila na hindi marvelous generality.
At saka ideally, mag-aaway-aaway sila.
Well, one is you can check lifestyle. Are they what's their lifestyle in terms of their use of energy? That's one thing. We do understand that really it can be a issue that can be raised with candidates. In fact, the Green Thumb Coalition has developed 9 themes which are related to not just energy. It includes also climate justice. It includes also, forestry and mining. These issues, which have been issues even before, can actually be revolve around what our candidates or political candidates can discuss as issues. But I do agree that we still have to raise these questions to them. Where in their agenda is the environment?
Okay.
Where in their agenda is really not just, we can go as basic as environment because that's what people know. Climate is so sometimes very esoteric, but I think a lot of things can be said about what are the candidates' proposed work or priorities when it comes to our environment. How are they going to ensure that now for every disaster that comes or every typhoon that comes into our country, is there sufficient funding for that? Is there a way that we're going to address it in a more cohesive, more cooperative manner? What's the priority? Especially since the Climate Change Commission, the head of the commission is the president. And if whoever he or she is, the chair of the commission is the president, then he or she will actually dictate how climate change should be, how good a priority it will be within their administration.
The president, whoever it is in the next administration, will also have to worry about economic recovery. Will also have to worry about the livelihoods of people. People have lost salaries, money, and so on. How do you address the concerns of people that climate discussions are not only esoteric? When people do have a grasp of the change that's needed, it's also expensive in their minds. You talk about shifting away from coal. You talk about the green economy. And the reality and the market realities for a lot of people, and some people are claiming, is that all of this is really very expensive in the short term, at the very least. I mean, how do you address that? Or is that argument no longer valid?
There is some validity to that. Like anything, when you talk about transition or transformation, there will be short-term pains. so to speak. But I think we have to bite the bullet when it comes to ensuring that we have a green transition. But we should also find ways to cushion that. And one is ensuring that we have clear policies. The policy should not just be like in terms of economics, but should really permeate into our social and political fiber. We should also ensure not only the financing, but also preparing and capacitating, our people even down to the ground. When you go to the rural areas, they can't feel climate change. They cannot express it the way, scientists would say what climate change is all about. But they can feel the impacts, and that's where you start. If they understand how the impacts are, they understand that there are ways by which we can solve this. For example, for agriculture, adapting sustainable agricultural practices, ensuring that you have maybe a fund by which they can enable them to adapt properly to the impacts of climate change. These are things that even our leaders should put in place and ensure that people also understand that they can access this readily. And many things should also take into account also that also translating the language into the maybe how people will understand it in the vernacular. Kasi nga, when you talk about climate change, ano ang climate change? Pagbabago ng klima ba yan? Nagbabago ng klima ba yan? Even the language has to be also something that we will have to get our people to get comfortable with, and even in this transition. But everything is already moving. And I think for us, dapat hindi tayo nahuhuli also eh. We should also ensure na that everyone is also up to speed on how this transition is going to happen. And it's happening faster than we know it. We just want also that while we're doing it, we're ensuring that no one is left behind. Ensuring also that by ensuring that no one is left behind, you're also including the justice and equity in the equation as well.
Well, in the short term, before election day, in the middle of this pandemic, is there something that you want to see that can help in climate change mitigation?
I think one thing that we want to see is ensure that there is a clear-cut policy in terms of how we handle the energy transition. We still do not have an energy transition plan. The DOE just issued the Philippine Energy Plan, but the energy plan doesn't take into account other aspects when you talk about energy transition. It should also encompass how we're relating to, for example, nature in terms of our energy use, how we're relating also to other economic systems. So I think one is we should have an energy transition plan, but also we should also include also the National Adaptation Plan, which we're still waiting from the Climate Change Commission. Clearly, if we are going to be feeling the impacts of climate change, and we're already feeling it, dapat ready na tayo with that adaptation plan. That's not just like a paper on the shelf, but really going down to the barangays, that they understand what this is, how it can help them, what is their role, and how each and every one of us can also contribute to climate resiliency through adaptation. Maybe also ensure that there is financing. I think to commend the DOF as well as the Bangko Sentral, there is a sustainable finance framework. So they're really getting our financial system and institutions already on board on sustainability. But I think there should also be more, not just capacity building, but really more understanding of how this sustainability should permeate the operations of our financial institutions, and eventually also ensure that there is access to financing for clean projects. clean and environmental projects. Only can we, when they have financing, can we ensure that we have, these projects really go up on the ground.
Attorney, the prognosis is that the Malampaya gas fields will only be good until the first quarter of 2027. And those gas fields provide clean fuel, relatively clean fuel, for 5 power plants that generate 30% of the power for Luzon. So yeah, kung wala mahanap na alternative na clean fuel for those power plants, what do we expect in terms of impact on climate change?
Well, you're right that that is something that is already on top of the minds of those in the energy sector. For us in WWF, though, while previously before we've thought of gas, natural gas, or many say now fossil gas as a transition fuel, the infrastructure there is like similar to constructing like a coal plant, in the sense that we foresee it later on to be a stranded asset. And in investing in it will actually might not be good for us in the long term. But we do recognize that there will be challenges also in terms of the effect to the economy by the when Malampaya actually goes out, and how our energy system will need to transition away. That's why we're very much keen in pushing for renewables now, even years before, to ensure that the renewables and energy efficiency really have space. Transition will not happen overnight. We do recognize that. But we have to think about, if we're putting our money on long-term investments and later on it will be too costly for us, we really should be rethinking how that transition will be moving towards. And we still strongly believe that renewables is still the best way to go. There are other discussions, for example, green hydrogen, new renewable technologies which are up and coming, might still be expensive, but we think that there is a lot to be said about how these technologies are readily already getting commercialized. Who would have thought solar will now cost very so in just a matter of how many years? And so there's a lot of investments now going into research for new cleaner, either cleaner fuels or new technologies that can harness more renewable energy sources. And so we're very hopeful for that. And especially, let's say, battery storage, if the price goes down further, we will see a real resurgence. And a lot of these smart technologies are also coming up, which can also make our grids smarter and more efficient, and also provide more flexibility.
Okay. Attorney Ibay, maraming salamat po. Attorney Angela Ibay is Climate and Energy Program Head for World Wildlife Fund Philippines. Maraming salamat po, Attorney.
Ingat po.
Thank you, Attorney Ibay.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of The Chiefs. We hope what was discussed here will keep the conversation going. Before we go, a reminder to our viewers, mask on, wash hands, stay safe, Philippines. I'm Robbie Alampay.
I'm Mami Paminton of the Philippine Star.
I'm Lucy Cruz Valdez of News 5.
I'm Ed Lingao, and we are One News.